I'd just maybe start even before I launch into my talk to congratulate the work of um, Eileen uh, and Laura. It's very topical. We just recently published a paper looking at the experiences of people who had been detained in the Australian-sponsored offshore camp on Nauru, and the sorts of issues that we've just heard about were very prevalent amongst the women that we interviewed, which was just a small qualitative study, yet even within that, excuse me, we still were able to see exactly what's just been described. So we don't need to really go to other continents to be able to describe the sorts of impacts on young women that Linda and Eileen have described. What I want to do today, though, is to talk about a paper that we published late last year. This is the work really of a postdoctoral research fellow of my group, Debbie Hocking, which looked at the factors which might be associated with mental health and mental disorder in adolescent refugees, and to see whether or not we could identify what sorts of problems adolescent refugees experienced and what might be factors that could predict those mental health outcomes in adolescence. There had been, and I will talk a little bit, or talk briefly about the surveys that have been conducted in settled refugees in Australia in the adolescent phase, which in particular is the BNLA, or Building Better Lives in Australia study, which documented quite significant and high levels of mental distress in adolescents. So we were much more interested in adolescents when they first arrived in Australia. So what we can see here is that if you look in the literature, firstly, there's a significant conflation of factors and studies when examining refugee and asylum seeker youth. Young people have been classified as anywhere between 0 and 25, and when data has been reported, any combination of those age groups have been described, which has made it very difficult to unpack what might be specific during adolescence. The reason we were interested in that was because adolescence is the age at which the vast majority of mental illnesses begin, and we wondered whether or not the antecedents for that might occur in early adolescence, and then we see the emergence of mental disorders in mid to late adolescence, and whether or not then factors associated with migration, both pre-migration traumas, migration traumas, and then post-migration factors might influence that onset of mental disorder, and to determine if that's the case, whether there might be the opportunity for intervention. So the factors that, of course, apply overall, and I'm talking here again between 0 and 18, which really apply to everybody who might be a child in a refugee context, are the sorts of losses that people might experience. And these can be relatively easily identifiable. Things such as obviously stability, and that's obviously the reason why people are moving, and in forcibly displaced circumstances. The insecurity of why they've had to leave, and obviously any transit experiences that they might have, but also the post-migration context, the loss of parental figures, or also the loss of functioning of parental figures, where parents might be so preoccupied with trying to keep the family together or the family alive, or because of mental illness or psychological distress, or because of the adversities that parents face, they may not be able to provide adequate parenting to the children. The social dislocation, where children will not necessarily be able to associate with peers or their normal social and friendship and peer networks. The loss of educational opportunities due to forcible displacement, and the straight physical health factors, so things that affect refugee children, such as malnutrition, physical illness due to the absence of vaccination and absence of healthcare. We've seen in studies which have principally been conducted in Western industrialized nations very high rates of mental illness in post-resettlement populations. So, for example, 18% for depression and 36% for PTSD in one meta-analysis. In another large meta-analysis, which again focused on a post-resettlement context, but looking at children between the ages of 6 to 19, found again very high levels of post-traumatic stress disorder between 19 to 50%. Again, high levels of depression between 10 to 1/3, high levels of anxiety disorders, emotional and behavioral problems. And overall, at least a third of refugee and asylum seeker youth seem to be affected by mental disorder. Now, these rates and this prevalence, or this prevalence from the meta-analysis, are not inconsistent, with what was also observed with the BNLA study, which was conducted in Australia in a context where children were surveyed about 5 years after resettlement in Australia. A more recent meta-analysis of child and adolescent refugee children that use diagnostic criteria found an overall prevalence again of 11% for PTSD. So quite high rates in these populations. So this is the paper that we published at the end of last year. And there are a couple of differences about this paper compared to the studies that I've presented. The main one was that we were strictly focused on refugee children. So we didn't include asylum seeker children in this cohort because we wanted to try and do a direct comparison with the BNLA study that I've just mentioned before. Secondly, we wanted to look at the adolescent vulnerability phase where, as I mentioned earlier, children might be developing or manifesting the early features of mental illness, with obviously then predisposing them to a higher risk of developing mental disorders as a young person and then into adulthood. And we wanted to focus on the initial post-resettlement phase because this was a time that wasn't captured in the BNLA study. And this also offers an opportunity for early identification and potential intervention if we found anything of significance. So we conducted this study in a pre-COVID time. So I think that's a very important factor in looking at these data. And obviously the impacts of COVID have affected young people much more than they've affected adults and older adults. And I think that's an important point. So if we were to do this again, we may well find different data. As I said, children aged 12 to 17, those who'd only been resettled in the last 12 months. And in fact, what we ended up finding were most of the children were less than 6 months. And we excluded all those kids who'd had a previously or currently identified mental disorder because we wanted to focus on kids who were not presenting with psychiatric or psychological symptoms. We interviewed the children, the adolescents, and we then interviewed the parents or parents separately so that we were able to collect data on the parents as well. We used a range of instruments, which are, if you like, the gold standard instruments in both adolescent population. So the Mini, which is a diagnostic interview for children. We used the RATS, which measures PTSD symptoms and trauma and gives you a PTSD diagnosis if you wish. And then the Arkenbach Youth Self-Report Scale, which gives a range of symptoms based on self-report. For the parents, we did an initial screen using our screening tool for PTSD and major depression. And then we used two self-report tools, the Harvard Trauma Questionnaire for PTSD and then the Hopkins Symptoms Checklist, which is, again, measuring depression and anxiety in this population. We were able to access approximately 114 children, and the reason for that was that they were the kids who were attending this, the English language schools that we were able to access. We excluded 7 children that had already had mental disorders or psychological distress identified and were receiving treatment for the same. And then of the children that we approached to participate, 20 refused or declined to participate. 4 children we couldn't find a suitable language interpreter, and there was 2 children who left before we could actually survey them. So in the end, we were able to sample 81. And of those 81 children, when we undertook screening for mental disorders using the Mini Kid, we found that 3 children already met criteria for a psychiatric diagnosis. We obviously then referred them to the appropriate mental health services. But just to note that these kids had already been living in Australia with, had gone through the refugee health screening, but hadn't been picked up to be suffering from mental disorders. And then we're able to survey 78 children who I'll present now. Now, this is obviously very small, so I won't expect you to read it, but I will point out a number of key points. The first is that it was a roughly even in terms of gender distribution. Most of the children did not speak English. They came principally from the Thai Burma camps, so it came from a number of ethnic groups who live on the Thai Burma border. Karen and Chin were the main groups. We also took a quota or number of kids from Iraq of a Syrian background, and then from southern and eastern Africa. They spoke languages which were appropriate for each of their ethnic groups. The majority, interestingly, were Christian, although there were a few Muslim and a few Buddhist children amongst them. We had sponsored refugees who came with family, and the children who came, just over half, almost 60% came from refugee camps. About 20 or about 26% came from a transit country, and then about 14% came directly from their country of origin. When we looked at the family composition, about 3/4 had both parents in Australia. Most of the children had other siblings. There were the majority of families identified as having the mother as the primary parent or guardian, and the mother was the one that was interviewed in the majority of cases. Again, parents didn't speak English. They generally were unemployed, although there were a small proportion who were employed both in skilled and unskilled work. These are the data from the children on the Arkenbach scale. So this is self-report looking at a range of symptoms clustered. The Arkenbach has about 95 questions, clustered into the major scales. What we can see here, firstly, is the maximum score that children can get. The higher the score, the more symptoms pertaining to that particular subscale. And then you can see the score that children self-reported. And in the far right column, the number of children who didn't report any symptom in that particular subscale. And I'll just look at, if you look at those numbers, you can see very high rates of children not reporting any symptoms associated with anxiety, depression, somatic complaints, social problems, attentional problems, etc. And even in the children who did report symptoms, you can see that the symptoms that were reported, the number of symptoms were comparatively low. The two scales bolded down the bottom are where they've been clustered into, if you like, broader groups of symptoms, internalizing symptoms and externalizing symptoms. And again, you can see comparatively low levels of symptoms in both larger subscales, and combined a low number. And I want you to remember that number, which is 16 for the sake of simplicity. We'll come back to that number in a moment. We can also use the ARC and BARC to attempt to get DSM-based psychiatric diagnoses. And this, again, is for a set of symptoms related to depression, anxiety, somatic problems, attentional problems, oppositional problems and conduct problems, and obsessive problems. Of course, children, generally speaking, won't be diagnosed with these disorders, but this gives us a reasonable indication of whether they might be exhibiting symptoms consistent at the severity of a psychiatric disorder. Again, if we look at the children who reported no symptoms or had 0 scores, very high proportions. The total, to refresh your memories, the total denominator here is 78. So you can see here that, for example, somatic problems, 60% of children didn't report any symptoms whatsoever. That almost 40% of children didn't report any depressive symptoms. And the mean scores are, again, comparatively low to what you might predict. Now, when we compare this to the mainstream population, so these are the scores that children in the general community in Australia report, 34.5 in a study that was done about a decade ago. I want you to compare that to the score I asked you to remember, which was 16. So refugee children within the first 6 to 12 months of resettlement or earlier report about half the psychological and psychiatric symptoms as a mainstream adolescent population in Australia. And that Australian score is comparable to the scores that have been reported across a wide number of countries, both low, middle, and high income countries. So what we can say is that in that initial post-resettlement phase, adolescent refugee children report less psychological symptoms than their mainstream counterparts. Now, again, apologies for the smallness of the font here, but every number that you can see here is significant. So even if you just look at the intersection of the scales down in the rows and the risk factors in the columns, anywhere where you see data, that's a significant association. So what we can see here is that in the children who did report symptoms, we can see a strong association between the number of traumatic events, for example, and the presence of anxiety and depressive symptoms on the ARC and BARC. Similarly, withdrawn and depressed symptoms, again, associated with a number of traumatic events. The columns that are presented here are the only ones that were positive, even though we examined a large number of independent variables. And all the variables here have been corrected for multiple testing. You can see that rule-breaking behavior was more associated, and here it was with males, but also with country of origin was associated with a number of the scales that you can see across here. And then criterion A refers to the severity of the traumatic symptoms. So we're really talking here about children who were exposed to a significant trauma, whereas here it's the actual number of traumatic events that are relevant. Time in Australia was predictive of depressive symptoms in a positive direction. So that means that the longer that the children were in Australia, the more likely they were to describe depressive symptoms. And then the two columns on the right that I want to flag are refugee camp and displacement. And the way that I explain this is these were children who were born in refugee camps, and this refers to children who had an experience of displacement into a transit situation before coming to Australia. So the refugee camp children were principally children who were, not principally, were exclusively children who were born and lived their life in a refugee camp before migrating to Australia, whereas the displaced children were children who were in a transit country or in a transit camp, so from their country of origin, transit situation before coming to Australia. You can see that very strong correlations with a whole range of symptoms. This now is with regards to the DSM-oriented scales, and just to make the point that where we're looking here more at disorders, we can again see the same strong relationships between the same independent variables of sex, country of origin, although that's less, criterion A exposure, which is again not difficult to predict, number of traumatic events, which again is not difficult to predict, and then refugee camp and displacement. When we looked at age, age was a significant predictor of multiple syndrome scales on the Arkenbach, and you can see all the syndrome scales that it was associated with. But the important point to remember was that 15 years of age appears to be the critical cutoff. Where we see symptoms and an association or correlation with age, it is present in children over the age of 15, and it's not present in adolescent children under the age of 15. So 12 to 14 don't appear to be associated with psychological symptoms in refugee children, whereas children 15 years and older is associated with a whole range of psychiatric symptoms in a self-reported situation. Now, this persists even when we've controlled for trauma symptoms in the pre-migration setting. So this appears to be independent of trauma exposure and applies in particular both to depression and depressive symptoms in both the Arkenbach and when we look at the Arkenbach in relationship to DSM diagnoses. When we look at the rats, which is a measure of post-traumatic stress symptoms, we found that 36% of adolescents had experienced a criterion A traumatic event. That is one which will lead to the diagnosis of PTSD in the sense of it qualifies as a PTSD relevant trauma. 80% reported exposure to only one event. The sorts of events that children reported were witnessing violence, disappearing, death, or injury of loved ones, exposure to a natural disaster. The really important thing about the scores that we observed on the rats were the very low scores that were overall described. And how low were these scores? If we look at the 90th percentile in the 78 adolescents that we surveyed, the score on the 90th percentile for the 78 was equivalent to the 10th percentile in a large Dutch sample of unaccompanied refugee minors that had been resettled in the Netherlands for an extended period. So what we're seeing is a low rate of PTSD symptoms being reported by adolescents in that initial post-resettlement phase. And you can see here the number of zeros for the range of symptoms that were described that are measured in the rats, including 32% of children who described no symptoms of PTSD whatsoever. Oh, sorry, I'm not sure what's happened there. Just lost my next lot of slides. I'll just go to the next one. Yeah, okay, so I just want to finish quickly in the last couple of minutes and let's back to slideshow. Not sure we're going to be able to do that. I'll show you the slides. I'll show you these slides just as they are, and hopefully you'll be able to read them. So what were the predictors of traumatic symptoms? And the first and the most important predictor, which was interesting, was that parental depression appeared to be a significant predictor of PTSD or hyperarousal symptoms in adolescent children or in adolescent refugees. And the second was a negative predictor, which is that children who were born and raised in refugee camps appeared to do better in terms of PTSD symptoms, hyperarousal symptoms, compared to those who'd been in transit situations. This also applied to avoidance symptoms and in total trauma symptoms. So the presence of being born and raised in a refugee camp was protective against PTSD symptoms. What was predictive of trauma symptoms was obviously the number of trauma events, which again is not unexpected, but also parental depressive symptoms, but not parental PTSD symptoms. So parents being depressed appeared to increase the presence of PTSD symptoms in refugee youth. When we looked at the displacement versus refugee camp issue more closely, we found that in fact the presence of both avoidance and numbing and total symptoms were predicted by the presence of being displaced, in contrast to those kids who'd been in a refugee camp setting prior to migration to Australia. So to conclude, this was the first study that we're aware of that looked at mental symptoms specifically in refugee adolescents in the immediate post-resettlement phase. And I think it's important because most studies have been conducted with kids who are either still asylum seekers and or who've been in a post-resettlement context for an extended period of time. We found, surprisingly, very low levels of morbidity and symptoms compared to mainstream host communities. And very importantly, much, much lower symptoms than what is present in adolescent refugees who've been resettled for a period of 5 years in Australia, which is the BNLA study. Internalizing and cognitive symptoms were much more frequent than externalizing symptoms. Avoidance and numbing appeared to be more characteristic of the trauma response in adolescent kids, as well as parental symptoms, parental depressive symptoms. And very importantly, the context in which the child came to Australia appears to be a critical factor in both a protective as well as in an exacerbating context. if the child came from a comparatively safe and settled pre-migration environment, such as a refugee camp where they'd been born and raised, they appeared to be protected against the impact of traumatic events. Whereas if the child had experienced displacement, that appeared to be associated with the presence of PTSD symptoms. And as we predicted, age was a critical factor in the manifestation of psychological and psychiatric symptoms, with 15 years of age being the critical tipping point between the expression of symptoms and the non-expression of symptoms. This is not to say that adolescents over the age of 15 are psychologically or psychiatrically ill, and those under the age of 15 are not. It's just the ability to express those symptoms appears to be critical at the age of 15. So I'll just finish by acknowledging the children and the parents who consented to participate in the study. The study was funded by Cabrini Outreach, and in particular, I want to thank Dr. Debbie Hocking, who did the majority of the work that I've presented today. Thank you.